is, of course, head of the French caucus in Congress, Gallagher being very French in its origin. He's also a Green Bay Packers fan. They are drafting 22nd overall. That means they may trade for Baker Mayfield because they need a quarterback in Green Bay. But Congressman Gallagher, I don't want to talk about the poor Packers and the fact that they're falling apart. I want to talk about what you can tell us about what you think is Putin's game here. Because I am now hopelessly as confused as everyone in the world. What does he want? Is he moving on Moldova? Is he withdrawing? What does he want as best you can guess?
Well, I will ignore all the slander that you crammed into your opener there, and focus on the substance of geopolitics, Hugh, if I can. I think, and this is my opinion, it's not based on anything we've been briefed upon by the intelligence committee, the armed services committee, but I think it should serve as an indication that while Putin has encountered unexpected friction in the early going of this war, and while he seems to have shifted his goals away from Kyiv and Kharkiv, he is not only dead set on consolidating gains in the southeast and the south coast of Ukraine and dominating the Black Sea, but potentially shifting his focus west, with Odessa being the key front, and potentially sniffing around to instigate a reason to invade and protect Russians in other areas, such as Transnistria, which is a pro-Russian breakaway region of Moldova, sort of analogous to how we think about the Donbass in Ukraine. So bottom line is, I think though Putin has experienced setbacks, his ambitions haven't changed, and his ambitions remain very expansive. It's to recover influence that has been lost since the fall of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was just the first step in a broader campaign to undermine NATO. And what's happening in Moldova, or the reports of explosions in Moldova, should be a reminder of just how hungry and ambitious and ruthless Putin is.
Congressman Gallagher, I mean, they've been talking about Transnistria now for at least 8 years. I mean, this has been on the table. It's part of Vladimir Putin's broader rhetoric about Russia being the protector of ethnic Russian enclaves all through Eastern Europe. And of course, that has to be of particular concern in the Baltic states, where there is a significant ethnic Russian population. But this isn't new. And why did it take so long, even after the 2014 invasion of the Donbass and Crimea? Why did it take so long for NATO and the U.S. to wake up to this?
Well, I think we got complacent. I think that's sort of the broad story of American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War has been one of complacency. We didn't have anyone breathing down the back of our neck, and we particularly underestimated the threat posed by Russia and China. And I think our European allies in particular were laboring under some naive delusions about the way that geopolitics work and the way you could substitute soft power for hard power. So what we are getting right now is a very costly wake-up call. And while we've had certain European allies say the right things, the Germans in particular, we need to follow through and make sure that they actually do things like invest more in their hard power, spend more money on defense. This is going to be a long and very difficult process of getting our European allies to invest more in their own defense and hardening NATO's eastern front. The other thing I'd say, and maybe even the more difficult task, lies not in the military domain, but in the economic and energy domain. I mean, look at what was even more concerning to me was the story that Putin is going to cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria, or has threatened to do that. The administration has been bragging about the unprecedented sanctions regime that it's imposed on Putin. But the fact is, there are still massive, gigantic loopholes in the sanctions we've put in place. And as Bing West wrote eloquently in the Wall Street Journal, we're sending about 1/10's worth of what Europe is still paying Putin for energy supplies. And Europe still remains somewhat hopelessly dependent on Russia for energy. We have to lock that down, and over the long term, we have to help our Europeans find an alternative source for energy. I think hard power analysts like myself tend to discount the role that energy plays in geopolitics, and we do that to our own detriment. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is a reminder that these things are thoroughly intertwined, and why it is so important to have true energy independence, and why it's so important for America, which is in an enviable position relative to Europe, to continue to invest in domestic energy infrastructure, including fossil fuels. And of course, this remains the biggest hole in the Biden administration's strategy. It remains intent on launching a war against domestic energy production. And that simply doesn't work. That weakens our geopolitical position, and it gives dictators like Putin and Xi a geopolitical gift.
Congressman Hugh again. Last night I was rereading, because of Matt Continenty's book, The Right, a 2011 piece by Peter Thiel in which he looked forward into the future, and it stood up very well. And 12 years ago he wrote, or 11 years ago he wrote, that he couldn't in good faith recommend anyone go into the nuclear industry in the United States because it was dead. I think we have to resurrect it. I think we have to get America back and the West back committed to the small reactors, building them everywhere. It's the only way, actually, to keep people free, because energy is freedom. It's also warmth and energy to power the cars that we need. It's the climate. It's everything. But if you run into the climate fanatics of the left, they don't like nuclear power because they inevitably link it up with nuclear weapons. And they think about 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. What do you think about the future of nuclear power?
There is no strategy forward without a dramatic investment in nuclear microreactor technology. And oh, by the way, there is no, I would argue, coherent strategy for moving forward to protect the environment that does not include nuclear energy. It is also a fantastic way to shore up a lot of our military bases domestically, which are too dependent on grids that are vulnerable to cyber attacks. This is also an area that China, our foremost adversary, is investing heavily in and would like nothing more than to dominate the nuclear microreactor technology. It absolutely has to be a priority for a future administration. This administration is not going to do it. It needs to be a priority for the Republicans in our argument to the American people about where we want to go. And if we master this, if we dominate this, if we beat the Chi-Coms, we will have an advantage for decades to come. Interestingly enough, the political sensitivities surrounding nuclear technology and the misinformation surrounding nuclear technology don't just affect us here in America domestically, and don't just allow the left to inveigh against this technology, which is necessary and a huge advantage for us if we did it right. It also affects some of our closest allies. Right now in the Australian election, for example, the incumbent government is being attacked for the AUKUS agreement, this nuclear submarine technology sharing agreement that we forged with the UK, Australia, and America, in part due to concerns over nuclear energy and environmental concerns over nuclear energy. It makes absolutely no sense, which is why we need to do a better job messaging this. And honestly, Hugh, that starts with us, Republicans that are making an argument to take back the House of Representatives. I believe we can lay out a strategy for American energy ascendance that resonates with the American people. That's an all of the above strategy, particularly right now in a moment when Americans are paying massive sums at the pump for bad, counterproductive energy policy motivated by a fear of the woke left and some of its bizarre environmental claims. Now is the time for us to strike while the iron's hot and lay out a transformative agenda for American energy. It's going to require some investment in research and development from the federal government in partnership with the states. But I believe over the long term, that's a smart, productive investment, and it's something we can afford.
Congressman, let's focus on what Europe should be doing in this moment. I mean, we've already talked about Russia cutting off Poland and Bulgaria for refusal to pay in rubles for Russian natural gas. They're threatening to cut off other European nations. This is an opportunity, as I wrote this morning, this is a detox opportunity for Europe. Are they positioned to start producing more of their own energy, first in fossil fuels and then in nuclear power? Or have they even awakened to the notion that they really do need a detox off of their addiction to Russia?
I hate to say it. I don't think so. I think, based on my limiting understanding of the politics there are even trickier than the politics in America when it comes to energy policy. And I fear, even though Europe has been undergoing a low-grade energy crisis for the better part of the last year, I fear there still hasn't been a massive wake-up call. So until that happens, what can they do? I mean, I think we probably have a bigger, more immediate opportunity to convince them to make hard power investments rather than to radically realter their energy orientation and policy. And even there, we have some challenges, as I mentioned at the start. I will start to believe all of this rhetoric surrounding NATO waking up and Germany waking up when I see things like intermediate range missile systems stationed in the eastern front of NATO, when I see permanent basing agreements with Poland and the Baltic states, I'll start to believe this. And when we talk about dependence on Russian energy, I think it's equally as important for us to continue to talk to our European allies about dependence on China for things like 5G infrastructure, for dependence on China for critical technologies. And of course, that gets to the glaring contradiction at the heart of the left's energy agenda, whether it's the European left or the American left. Ironically and tragically, those who advocate electric vehicles and abandoning fossil fuels would make us more dependent on the Chinese Communist Party and on slave labor in China because, of course, the supply chain for batteries for electric vehicles leads you right back to Beijing, and that is unacceptable. We have to be very wary of trading one set of dependencies for another set of dependencies. I'll close with this. As we shake our heads and scratch our heads looking at how the Europeans could have gotten themselves in such a precarious position with Russia over energy, we need to look at ourselves and realize we are in a similar position vis-a-vis China in certain critical technologies because of our complacency and our naivety, and we need to reverse that before it's too late.
Congressman Mike Gallagher, I am hoping that they bring Brett Favre 2.0 to Green Bay tomorrow. Baker Mayfield up in the north would be a great thing because he is the reincarnation of Brett